Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 3 to 4 player game, Catan New Energies, designed by Klaus and Benjamin Teuber, and published by Catan Studio, who helped sponsor this video. In the original best-selling Catan, players made a living as farmers on a newly discovered island. But in this new standalone game, it's the 21st century, and today's Catanians need new forms of energy for their thriving society. But do you go for the cheaper fossil fuels, risking pollution, or invest in clean energy and their higher financial costs? You're at a crossroads. What will be best for your modern society? Only one way to find out. Join me at the table, and let's learn how to play. To set up, first find these frame pieces. Each will show 4 whales on one side and 3 whales on the other. Ensure the number of whales facing up matches your number of players. We'll assume we have 4 players in this video, turning them all to this side. Each frame piece should be joined where the numbers on their ends match. For example, these 2 go together because they both show 1s here, and then these attach here because they both have 2s, and so on. It will look like this when you're done, and then you collect these terrain pieces and fill them into this central area. The rules explain how to do this randomly, so you get a different island each time you play. But for your first game, they suggest matching the exact arrangement of tiles shown on these pages. After your first game, when you want to create random setups, just follow the steps shown on these 2 pages. The tiles are made up of multiple pastures, mountains, forests, fields, and hills, along with a single desert. Once you've added the tiles to the inside of the frame, it should match the diagram shown for your first game. You then collect and set these numbered discs on every tile as shown in the diagram, so it looks like this when you're done. The desert tile won't have a numbered disc. Instead, you add this environmental inspector there. On the outside of the board, you'll find this global footprint track. You now set this marker on the 9 space in a 3-player game, but with 4 players, as we have here, you set it on the 12. Now find the cards with this back and sort them into their various types. You'll have 5 types of resources known as lumber, brick, natural fiber, food, and steel, as well as these science cards. Place each stack in a row nearby, then find and shuffle the development cards, which have this back, into a face-down pile. Nearby, also set this cleanest environment and longest trade route tile, along with these hazard and energy tokens and the 2 dice. These are known as the brown event discs, and you'll add all of them to the included bag. Each player now collects a player board, 5 of these town pieces, 4 cities, 12 roads, and 1 victory point marker in their chosen color, as well as 6 brown fossil fuel and 9 green renewable power plant discs, and a warehouse tile. Each player then adds their victory point marker to the far left space of this victory point track found on the board. Then the players each add 1 town, 1 city, and 2 roads to the board, exactly as shown in this diagram. Again, in later games, you can use the steps on these pages to create a random setup. And I should mention, in a 3-player game, you just don't use the blue pieces. As we'll see during the game, every tile on the board except the desert is able to generate a particular type of resource. Forests produce lumber, hills produce bricks, fields produce food, pastures produce natural fiber, and mountains produce steel. Each player now looks at their city piece on the board and collects 1 card from the supply, matching the resource each of the 3 surrounding tiles generate. So the blue player would collect 1 lumber, 1 food, and 1 brick, like we see here. Every player also collects 1 science card, and although you'll know what cards everyone begins the game with, for the rest of the game, you keep the cards you're holding a secret from the other players. These are the green event discs. If you have 3 players, return any with the number 4 printed on them back to the box. Either way, the ones you have are then mixed face down, giving 9 randomly to each player. Without looking at their other side, every player puts their green discs face down onto what are known as the 9 renewable power plant spaces of their board. They then set their green power plant discs on top of those spaces and their brown fossil fuel power plant tokens on these spaces, so it looks like this when they're done. You now add your town and city pieces to the leftmost matching spaces of these tracks and your roads to this area, so it looks like this when you're done. You then put your warehouse tile with this side face up here. Every player then rolls the dice, and the player with the highest total will be the first player, re-rolling any ties for highest value. We'll say that blue won. And that's the setup. In Catan New Energies, players will gather resources, trade them with other players, and use them to build new towns and cities and earn points. Be the first to have 10 points on your turn, and you win. However, you'll also be trying to strike the best balance of energy between renewable and fossil fuels, as we'll see. The game is played over a series of turns, beginning with the first player, blue in this case, and then going clockwise around and around the table. And on your turn, you resolve 4 phases in order, starting with the event phase. Here you check to see which row of the global footprint track the marker is currently in. To the left of that row, it will show the event bag and a number of symbols representing how many tokens you draw from it. In this case, 1. Now, if the token had been, let's say, here, you'd draw 2 tokens instead. If you're drawing more than 1 token from the bag during a turn, take them out one at a time and fully resolve one before drawing the next. At the start of the game, the bag will only contain brown event discs, but later, green discs may be added to be drawn out as well. But either way, when a disc is taken from the bag, you find the matching spaces for it around the outside edge of the board and set it into one of the empty ones. Most spaces around the outside edge of the board are brown or green, but these ones here are a bit different. They're brown and green. This means when you draw a green token from the bag or a brown one, they go into these spaces. And again, we'll go over how green tokens end up in the bag a bit later. Nothing happens when a token is added to the board until all of the spaces for that group are full. Then the related event is resolved. Turn to the back of the rulebook and resolve the effect for that type of event. In this case, it says that the active player, the person whose turn it is, rolls the dice and totals their value, re-rolling 7s. We'll say we got an 8. It then tells us to add one of these hazard tokens to any tile with that matching value on its numbered disc. That means it could be placed either here or here. Now, later we'll see that this inspector can be moved to different tiles, and a hazard token can never be placed where the inspector is located. So in this case, we'd have to put it here. We won't go through all the different event effects in this video, as how they work is described in detail on the back of the rulebook, but I'll quickly show you the rain and flooding event. It's represented by this symbol, and when all of its spaces are full, each player must take a hazard token and add it on top of any one of their towns or cities like this. We'll see the effect of hazard tokens later, but just know each tile, city, or town piece can only have, at most, 1 hazard token added to it. Ignore any effects that would add a hazard to a piece that already has one. After an event has been resolved, return all of its tokens from the board back to the box. Now, there might still be more of those tokens in the bag to be drawn later, which can refill and trigger this effect again. Remember, I mentioned that the number of tokens you draw from the bag during the event phase is based on the row that this marker is in at the start of the current player's turn. Now, if drawing and resolving an event causes this marker to move to a new row, you don't change how many tokens you draw that turn. You always draw as many as its position had been in at the start of the player's turn. If you ever need to draw a token from the bag, but it's empty, the game ends. And we'll talk more about that later. For now, let's move on to the next part of a player's turn, the production phase. Here, the current player, blue in this case, rolls the dice and totals their value. For the sake of our example, let's pretend they rolled an 8. Now look for every terrain tile with that value on it, so here and here. Each player now earns 1 resource that those tiles produce for each town and or city they have on their borders. Blue has a city here, so they gain a brick resource from the supply, and so does purple for their town. By this field tile with a number 8, orange and pink each have a city, so they each gain 1 food resource. Each player also earns 1 science card from the supply for each of their cities by the tiles that were rolled. So blue, orange, and pink each gain a science card from this roll. So towns give you the related resource from the tile, and cities also give you the related resource, but cities also give you a science card. We'll see how you can add more of your pieces to the board later, but as another example, if the blue player had their pieces here when an 8 is rolled, they'd gain 1, 2, 3 brick resources, and then their 2 cities here would earn them 2 science cards. Resources you collect go from the supply to your hand. Now, if a player is owed a resource and the supply for it has run out, they just collect as much as they can. If more than one person is owed a type of resource at the same time and there isn't enough for everyone to get what they're owed, none of those players collect that resource. We'll see later that power plants can be added to the curved sections of towns and cities. And when a tile is rolled where you have power plants, you also gain an energy token from the supply for each power plant located there. So 2 energy in this case. As you gain energy, add them to these spaces of your board, ignoring any you would gain beyond the 5 that you can hold at a time. Here's something else to be aware of. Remember, we saw how events can add these hazard tokens to tiles, towns, and/or cities. If a town or city has a hazard, it will not gain resources if the related tile is rolled, and its plants won't produce energy. So in a case like this, if we roll the 12, this tile will produce a lumber and a science for this purple city, and then the blue town here with its power plant would gain a lumber and energy, but this orange city here and its power plant with a hazard token on it won't generate anything. Now, if a hazard is directly on a tile, then nothing is produced here for anyone. With that understood, I'll mention there's no limit to how many cards you can have. But having a lot can be risky if a 7 is rolled on the dice during the production phase. You'll notice there are no number 7 tokens anywhere on the board, so when a 7 is rolled during the production phase, no resources are generated. Instead, each player with 8 or more cards in their hand must select half of them, rounded down, to return to the supply. So if I had 9 in my hand, like I do in this example, I'd pick any 4 of them to return face up to their different piles by the board. As we'll see later, you may end up with development cards in your hand which have this back. However, when checking to see if you have 8 or more cards in hand, you do not count these. Only resource and science cards, which have this back, can put you over the limit. After players discard, if any, the current player moves this environmental inspector to any tile without a hazard token. Now, it must always go to a new tile, but on a future turn, if it moves again, it can return to a spot it had been previously. If the new place it goes has a number token, cover it up. This tile will no longer produce anything while the inspector is here. Then the current player picks one person, if any, with a city or town adjacent to that tile and takes a random card from their hand. Just know you can never steal development cards from another player which have this back. Only the ones with this back, which represent resources or science cards, can be stolen. Okay, so just to recap, during the production phase, the current player rolls the dice, and then the related tiles produce resources and/or energy for players with towns, cities, or power plants adjacent to them, unless the environmental inspector is at that location or hazards are stopping production. However, if you roll a 7, nothing produces. Players with 8 or more cards must return half of them, rounded down, back to the supply, and then the current player moves the inspector, stealing a card from any one player with a city or town adjacent to the inspector's new location. I'll also mention there are dots, like we see here on these numbered tokens, and these are a visual way of reminding you of how likely the different values are to be rolled during the production phase. The larger the size of the number and the more dots you see, the greater the chance that a number of that value will be rolled. And red values are the most likely to produce. All right, at the end of the production phase, you then remove all hazard tokens from hexes, towns, and cities that did not produce this turn because of those hazards. Other hazards that didn't affect production will just remain in play. And that ends the production phase. You then move to the action phase of your turn. Here, you take actions in any order you like, as often as you want or can afford. So let's learn the different types of actions, starting with trading. One option is to trade with other players. Just ask for what you want and say what you're willing to offer in exchange from what you have. Your trades can include any number of resources, science cards, and energy tokens. You might say, "Can I have some lumber? I have food to offer." Nobody wants food? "Oh, you want steel? I don't have steel." "I do have brick. Would you like brick?" "You would? Great. Okay, well then I'll offer you a brick for a lumber." "You want 2 of my brick for 1 lumber." "Huh, okay, well, I'll give you 2 brick if you give me 1 lumber and 1 energy." You get the idea. You're never forced to accept a deal you don't want, and neither is anyone else. And there are really only 2 restrictions when trading. 1, all trades must happen with the player whose turn it is. I'm the blue player, so on my turn, pink and purple couldn't trade with each other, only with me. The other restriction is you can't just give resources away. For example, I couldn't offer 3 lumber in exchange for 1 lumber, because in that case, really, I would have just given away 2 lumber. As we'll see, resources and energy can help you build roads and buildings. So that's why you might want to trade resources. But in addition to trading with other players, you can also freely trade with the supply. To do this, trade in any 4 of the same type of resource for any 1 of another type of resource, maybe steel in this case. Or as another option, you can exchange 3 science cards for any 1 resource. We'll come back to other ways of trading in a moment, but for now, it will help to learn another action you can take during your turn, building. Here, you pay resources from your hand back to the general supply in order to construct roads, towns, cities, and power plants. The costs are shown beside where they're located on your player board. For example, to build a road, I would need to return 1 lumber and 1 brick back to the supply, and then I place a road piece from here onto the board. Roads are always added to paths, which are the spots where the sides of 2 tiles meet, and they must connect to at least 1 other town, city, or road you have on the board. For example, I could place a road here, here, perhaps here, or maybe here. At most, only 1 road may be on each path, so now no other road can be set here by me or anyone else. Also be aware you may not build a road past an opponent's town or city. So I couldn't connect a road here going through this town. That said, I could potentially build blue roads down from this city in order to get along this path from this other direction. The first person to build a continuous connection of roads in their color made up of at least 5 road pieces, not interrupted by other players' towns or cities, collects this longest trade route tile, which is worth 2 victory points represented by the symbols here. If your road branches off in different directions, like we see here, don't count all the various branches. So here I could count this as a road of 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, or 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. You don't include any roads you'd have to backtrack for. On the other hand, if we had these pieces here, now all of them would count as a continuous path because I could count it like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I was able to follow the path without branching off or backtracking. And remember, other players' towns and cities break up your roads. For example, here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 road pieces, but an opponent's town is breaking them up, so they are counted as separate segments of 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2, 3. Now, an opponent's road coming up to your roads doesn't break them up. So this is still a path of 1, 2, 3, and you'll notice your own towns and cities do not break up your road segments either. Now, as I had mentioned, earning this tile is worth 2 victory points, which you show by advancing your marker here that many spaces. Once you have the longest trade route tile, you keep it until someone else makes a road longer than your longest road. Tying you is not enough. They must make a longer road than your longest road. And if they do, they'll take this tile from you. Now, if you lose this tile to someone else, you also lose its 2 points, and the player who takes this tile then gains them. So make sure you represent that here on the victory point track like I've done here. So with that, we've covered building roads. Now, let's learn how to build a town. First, I should explain what an intersection is. These are the spots on the board where two or more tiles touch at their corners. Adjacent intersections are any that are a single road length away from each other, whether a road is placed between them or not. For example, this intersection is adjacent to this one. To build a town, spend a lumber, brick, food, and natural fiber resource, as shown here, and then move one of your town pieces to any empty intersection connected to one of your roads, as long as there are no towns or cities already in any adjacent intersections to where you want to place it. For example, I could add this town here adjacent to my road because this intersection is empty, and so are all of the adjacent intersections. I could not place a town here because there's a piece already in this adjacent intersection. And remember, towns generate resources for you if they are next to a tile whose number is rolled during the production phase of a player's turn. So be thoughtful about where you build towns. It's usually good to be able to get into spots where you're more likely to have your numbers rolled, but that's not the only consideration. For example, building towns on an outside edge means you're only beside one or two tiles, but there are benefits to building on intersections that show one of these two harbor features. Remember, on your turn, you can always trade 4 of the same resource for any one other resource. But if you have a town on a harbor, you can instead trade any 3 matching resources for any one of another type. If you have a town on one of these special harbors, they'll show a specific resource. You can now trade 2 of that resource for any one of another type. And remember, you can make as many trades as you want during a turn. So I could trade 2 bread for a brick, and then 2 more bread for a steel. When you build a town, you also gain a victory point, so that's another good reason to build them. After adding a town to the board, you move your victory point marker 1 space forward on the victory point track. Here's another important detail about building a town. It exposes one of these pollution icons. The number of exposed plus icons on your board is how much pollution your buildings are currently creating. In this case, a total of 4. This total is known as your local environmental footprint, also referred to in the rules as your LF. If you add all of the players' local environmental footprints together, you get what is known as the global footprint, or GF. This total global footprint should always be represented by the position of this marker on the global footprint track. So when a player's local footprint goes up or down, you adjust this marker. With 4 players, the marker starts on position 12 because that's the total of all the players' local footprints from towns and cities that begin on the board. When a player builds a new town, they increase this marker by 1. Also be aware, if this marker would ever need to go above 28 or below 0, just leave it on the 0 or 28 space. It cannot go past these far ends. If you think the players might have forgotten to adjust the marker, just quickly total all of the players' local footprints and adjust the global marker as necessary. Now that we understand how the local and global values are determined, I'll mention that some events will refer to the player with the lowest LF or highest LF, again LF standing for local footprint. If more than one player is tied for that position, highest or lowest, they are each affected by the event and resolve it one at a time, going from whoever is closest to the current player and then clockwise from there. On the other hand, if every player has the same value, then none of them are affected by the event. So just to be clear, if an effect targets the player with the highest local footprint, then one or more players must be highest compared to someone else. If every player has the same value, then the event is just ignored. All right, with that, we've covered a few different things. Now let's go back to building and see how cities are constructed. You make these by upgrading one of your previously built towns by spending 2 food and 3 steel, as it shows here. You then take back one of your towns from the board and put a city into its place. This means you can never build a city directly. Cities must always replace one of your previously built towns. We'll see how these power plants can be added to the board later, but if a town you're upgrading to a city has one, attach the power plant to the city, keeping it on the same tile that it had already been on. Now remember, cities produce one science card and one of the resource they're adjacent to if that tile's number is rolled during the production phase. But they are also worth 2 victory points. Since a city always replaces a town, and a town is worth 1 point, building a city means you advance your marker by just 1 point, because you're gaining 2, but returning the town causes you to lose 1. You also might have noticed that players start the game with 3 victory points, and that's because everyone begins the game with 1 town and 1 city in play for a total of 3 victory points. Also notice that each city you build adds 2 pollution to your local footprint, but since the town you replaced goes back here, you'll be removing 1 pollution. So a city increases your footprint by just 1 overall. And you of course show that by adjusting the global footprint track. Next up, we're going to learn about building power plants, and you may only build at most 1 power plant during each of your action phases. That said, some events may allow a player to build a power plant during the event phase, and if so, you can still build one during your action phase as well. There are 2 types of power plants, fossil fuel and renewable energy. You must pay 1 science card to build a fossil fuel power plant, taking it from your player mat. You'll notice this increases your local footprint by 1, so adjust the global footprint accordingly. When putting a power plant on the board, it must be added to a tile and attached to an empty cutout section of one of your towns or cities. Towns only have 1 spot for a power plant, so rotate it towards the tile you want the plant to be set on, and then put it there. Cities have slots for up to 3 power plants, so just make sure it's rotated so that each potential plant can go onto a different hex. If you wish to build a renewable power plant instead, that costs 3 science cards, and then you take one of these. Under the power plant, you'll find a green event disc, which you then add to the bag, revealing it to the players as you do. This is how green disc events enter the bag. And again, the effects of all events can be found on the back of the rulebook. You might also remember that I said the game ends when you would need to draw a token from the bag and it's empty. So by adding green tokens to the bag, it allows the game to go longer, perhaps helping you to get the extra points that you need. I should also mention that while you must always draw events randomly from the bag, you are allowed to check inside of the bag, particularly to see how many tokens are remaining in it. It's only when you're actually drawing that you have to make sure you're not looking inside. You'll notice that building a renewable power plant exposes a single negative pollution symbol, meaning your local footprint goes down by 1, which also drops the global footprint by 1. So that's how you build power plants. And remember, every plant on a tile gives its owner 1 energy token from the supply when that tile produces during the production phase. So if this tile was rolled, then the blue player would gain 2 energy and the purple player would gain 1. Remember, power you gain is added to these spaces, and you can never have more than 5 at a time. Any extra you might gain beyond that is just ignored. That said, during your action phase, you can spend energy that you have here on these listed options. If you spend 2 energy, you can take any 1 resource or science card from the supply. If you spend 1 energy, you can remove a hazard from any hex or town or city of your choice. Spending 1 energy also allows you to demolish a fossil fuel power plant you had previously built. You take it from anywhere on the board and return it to one of the spaces here. That will cover up one of your pollution symbols, lowering your local footprint value by 1. This 1 times symbol here also reminds you that you may only demolish at most 1 fossil fuel plant per action phase. Finally, you can also spend 2 energy to build your warehouse, flipping this token over. This means that when a 7 is rolled, you don't have to discard any cards if you're holding 10 or fewer. Remember, normally if you have 8 or more cards, you have to discard half of them when a 7 is rolled during the production phase. But with a warehouse, you only lose half your cards if you have 11 or more. And those are all the things that you can build. During your action phase, you can build as many things as you want and can afford, except for power plants. You can only build 1 of those per turn. But keep in mind, you're limited to the pieces you have in front of you. If you build all your roads, you can't build any more. And once you run out of towns, you can't build any more towns until you build a city and take a town back. But with that understood, there's one more thing you can do during your action phase. Buy developments.
As you're reminded here, these cost 1 food, 1 natural fiber, and 1 steel resource. You then draw the top card from this deck, adding it to your hand. At any time during your turn, you may play a single development, so long as it isn't one you just acquired that turn. So if I just acquired this one, I couldn't play it yet, but on my next turn, I'd be able to if I wanted. And development cards come in 3 different types. These are known as progress developments. When you play one of these, you resolve its effect and then return the card to the box. These are victory point cards. They can help you win the game, and we'll come back and discuss them more a little later. Finally, we have cleanup cards. When you play one of these, either move the inspector to a new hex, stealing a resource from a player who has a town or city there, if any, or instead play this to remove 1 hazard from a hex, town, or city of your choosing, and then steal 1 random resource or science card from a player with the same or higher local environmental footprint compared to you. No matter which option you choose, place the cleanup card in front of you, and the first player to have 3 of these played collects this Cleanest environment tile, which is worth 2 victory points, which you'd indicate on the score track. Anytime a player has more cleanup cards played than anyone else, they collect the tile from wherever it is to take it for themselves and claim the points instead. And those are the rules for development cards. If its deck ever runs out, then no more can be bought. And remember, when a 7 is rolled during the production phase, you do not count any development cards you have when determining if you have more than 7 cards in hand. Now, if you are over the limit based on your resources and science cards, you only get rid of resources or science cards, not developments. Players also can't steal developments from you. They can only take your resources or science cards. So those are all the actions you can perform during your action phase. You can trade with other players, trade with a supply, build roads, towns, cities, a power plant. You can spend energy and buy developments and play at most 1 development you gained from a previous turn. Only once you've done all the actions you can or want to does your turn end by passing the dice and bag to the next player seated clockwise around the table, where they'll begin their turn, starting with the event phase. Now remember, the object of the game is to be the first person to get 10 points. We know you get points for towns and cities you've placed on the board and from having either or both of these tiles. And all of these points you record on the victory point track here. If on your turn those points combine to give you 10 or more points, you win. But remember, you might also be secretly holding some points in your hand on your development cards. Other players won't know you have these, but you should imagine they're included in the total points you currently have. Because unlike other developments, you can reveal these during your turn, even on a turn you gain them, if that would cause you to have 10 or more points in total. For example, let's say it's my turn and I currently have 9 points. If I then built a town, that would earn me an additional point, bringing me to 10, which would cause the game to end and make me the winner. But let's say it came to my turn and I had 9 points on the board. If I then bought a development card worth a victory point, I could immediately reveal it and win. In fact, if you have several victory points in your hand, you can reveal them all. You don't have to worry about the normal limit of playing only 1 development card per turn, or having to wait an entire turn before playing a development you just acquired when it comes to revealing victory points that would allow you to win. Just remember, you can only win on your own turn. If I had 10 victory points, but it wasn't my turn, I won't win until it is my turn. Now, all that said, the game can end before a player earns 10 points. If a player needs to draw an event disc from the bag, but they can't because it's empty, then the game immediately ends. How you win changes in this case. You now need to have the largest positive value after subtracting how many fossil plants you built from the number of renewable power plants you built. For example, if the game ended and our boards looked like this, I've built 6 renewable energy plants, but I subtract these 2 fossil fuel plants for a final positive total of 4. This player would have 4 minus 3 for a final total of 1. This player has 7 minus 5 for 2. And this player has 1 minus 6 for a final total of minus 5. Not great. The player with the largest positive value when comparing their different plants wins. In this case, I'd win with my positive 4. If there's a tie, the tied player with the most victory points wins. If there's still a tie, those tied players share the victory. On the other hand, if the game ends because the bag runs out when you would need to draw an event disc, and no players have more renewable plants than they have fossil fuel plants, then all the players lose.
Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Catan New Energies. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get a notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.